In this video, I'm going to be doing a teardown of a Sony Vaio VGN-U71P. I'll be replacing the built-in spinning hard drive with a compact flash-based SSD solution. I'll then give some tips on how to install an operating system, and then finally give a tour of the built-in factory Japanese Windows XP install. But first, some history and specs. These Sony Vaio U series Windows XP tablets came out in 2004 in Japan. There were 4 different models with slightly different processors, hard drive sizes, memory sizes, with the U750P getting a US release. Processors range from a Celeron M 900 MHz to a Pentium M1 or 1.1 GHz. The U50 came with only 256 megabytes of RAM. Everything else came with 512. This is a highly proprietary module. It's not really upgradable. You can't go beyond the 512. So you can only really swap the 256 module in the base to a 512. You get either a 20 or 30 gigabyte, 1.8 inch 50-pin IDE spinning hard drive. It has a 5-inch 800 by 600 resolution touchscreen, and it came pre-installed with Windows XP. So taking a look at my Vaio, on the bottom we have our 16-volt DC in jack and our dock connector. Along the side we have our sole USB port, our Wi-Fi enable disable switch, a recess button to send a Control-Alt-Delete keyboard combo. On the opposite side, we have our power button with a hold switch. Then a headphone jack with a remote control unit connector next to it for an inline track display screen and navigation controls. Up top, we have the lock and release buttons for the battery, a compact flash slot, as well as a Sony memory stick slot, and then a standby button. Taking a look under the battery, which is the entire back cover. Here's the VGA/Ethernet dongle. You get the same ports on the full docking station. If interested, it has a little button that swaps between the internal tablet screen and the external monitor. One thing of note, only the specific adapter seems to work on the U5070 tablets. I have a couple other adapters with the same dock connector, like this one came from my Vaio UX, but it didn't seem to work. It's also complicated because they don't really show a part number on the backs of the little adapters. Finally, the included keyboard, since this is a tablet, it's got kind of a cool fold-out mechanism. It also has a built-in track point mouse all over the single USB cable. Let's take a quick look at the dock. Mine didn't come with a dock, so here are some pictures I found. See, we have 3 USB ports on the back, 1 on the side, our VGA out, Ethernet jack, 16-volt power pass-through, and our iLink/Firewire connector with optional power connector. So let's begin the disassembly, starting by removing the battery. Next, I'm going to take a look underneath these 2 plates. This isn't necessary for disassembly, I'm just interested to see what's underneath. This first one's a little weird. It just seems to give you better access to the memory stick slot. Not quite sure why you would need this. Maybe it helps if a card gets stuck or something. Underneath this next little door, we have the proprietary memory module. These are pretty rare. This isn't really an upgrade that you'd be likely to do. This is a 512 megabyte module. Now, all of the U series came with 512 megabytes, the maximum, except for the U50, which came with 256 megabytes, so potentially you could swap that. Next up, we remove the case screws. They're all marked with arrows. They're all the same size, nothing hidden. We give a little pry to the bottom plate, and it'll pop off. Removing these two little metal inserts on each side that are just kind of sitting in place. They were captured by a screw. I think these are used for the dock to lock into. Next up, to remove the plastic trim, the body, remove the compact flash blank, and we just kind of pry around the edges of the screen. It should pop off. You can kind of flex it a little bit if you need to. Next up, we have 3 ribbon cables along the edges that we need to disconnect. Just kind of flip up the connectors. And then finally the screw going into the grounding lug on the power jack. It's easier to loosen it up this way than to try to disconnect the connector from the motherboard. You may notice that some of the other screws have been removed holding on the motherboard. I thought they were holding on the motherboard, but they're not. They're just holding on brackets, so you can leave them in place. You can see they're back here. So we're going to flip this open like a book to get access to the hard drive. And all that's actually holding it together is this little clip up by the vent. We just have to pop it off the little tab, then you can open it up. So we have a couple of Wi-Fi antennas connecting the two halves, but we can just leave those in place. So we have a single screw to remove the hard drive cage, and it's held in by some clips. And here's that clip along the edge, clipped around the motherboard. We just pop it off. Now it's also being held by a tab going through the board. You can see in the bottom right as I try to slide this off, so it won't just slide off, and we can't angle it up enough to slide off while it's still on the connector. So here I am trying to remove the hard drive cage from the drive. It's not screwed on, but it's really stuck. I figured maybe it was glued or they'd use some double-sided tape. After getting it off though, I realized that there's some rubber strips on each side. They started to go bad, and that's what's making them stick inside here. So some gentle prying, making sure I stay on the edges of the drive to get it to pop out. Now I can angle up the bracket, slide out of the slot, and then remove the drive. I'm going to remove the CMOS battery just to be safe. I'm not sure if it's necessary for this one. And now for our compact flash solution, we're going to use some Transcend 32GB industrial compact flash, good for Windows XP, and this 50-pin adapter. You need to trim off these little wings on the adapter, otherwise they interfere with the little alignment tabs on the motherboard, and you can't push it in all the way. I also trimmed the jumper leads on the back of the adapter. A little double-sided tape just to help hold it in place. Now I'm reinstalling the hard drive bracket. Technically, this isn't really holding the drive in place anymore. If you recall, we only actually screw the bracket down in the upper right. You can see there are screw holes in the other three corners. A couple of the screws that go through the bottom plate that we took off at the very beginning will require these. You could always just leave those screws off. We install our single hard drive bracket screw. I'm double checking to make sure the bracket is clipped around the motherboard. We just carefully fold it back over. We snap the little clip into the tab on the vents to hold the two halves together. There's a little plastic standoff here. I'm just tucking the Wi-Fi antennas onto the other side of it. Kind of helps keep them in place. Screwing the power jack back down and then reconnecting the 3 ribbon cables. So next we need to pop that plastic ring back around. We need to pay attention to these switches. Here on the side we have the hold button and that sliding power button. The Wi-Fi button on the other side. We want to make sure the switches on the trim made up with those. So starting from the bottom, but this trim is fairly flexible, so you can kind of bend it around to get it where you need it. So I'm going to test the buttons to make sure they're actually lined up. You should be able to feel as you move them if they're just freely moving or they're jammed or if they're actually making a connection. You can feel the switch inside actually moving. If they're not lined up, it's flexible enough that you can just leave the trim in place, just kind of pull it away a little bit and move the switches to their proper positions. And we're also clipping the plastic trim into the screen. Replace the two metal clips on either side, two different sizes. Place the bottom cover, start at the bottom at an angle, and then drop it in. And finally, we reinstall the screws and the battery, and the assembly is complete. Now let's do our first boot and take a look at the different BIOS settings. So now let's talk about installing an operating system. These originally came with Windows XP from the factory. And although you have USB ports, you cannot boot from a USB CD-ROM or a USB thumb drive, so you'll need to install from a FireWire/iLink CD-ROM drive. I believe you can also boot from a USB floppy drive. I'm not sure if it's possible then to load drivers for a USB CD-ROM or not. Now I actually have a couple of Sony iLink CD-ROM drives, but my problem is my little tablet didn't come with a dock, and you only get the FireWire ports on the dock. Now I did briefly consider using my Sony Vaio UX dock. If you take it apart, you can plug it in. It's the same connector, but who knows if it's wired the same. Don't want to risk frying something, especially considering different VGA Ethernet dongles from later models didn't seem to work in this one. Luckily, I could avoid all this because my Vaio still had a working hard drive and still had the factory recovery partition intact. So I was able to image that recovery partition with Norton Ghost, restore it to my compact flash, and then boot into recovery mode on the Vaio itself. I'm uploading this recovery partition to archive.org as a Windows XP Service Pack 2 Japanese language. After I'd done the recovery, there was a Sony utility in Windows to create your own recovery media, either 4 CDs or 1 DVD. I'll put these on archive.org as well if anyone wants them, but chances are these will be model locked to only install on the U71P. I'm not sure if the recovery partition also does a model check. I'd suspect not, but I'm not sure. Otherwise, as of this moment, it looks like the only other recovery media on archive.org is for the U50 and the US model U750P. One last interesting note that I'd never really seen before. After doing the recovery and doing the Windows setup out-of-box experience, there were new steps added, specifically showing the little fold-up keyboard, telling the user to plug it in, as well as a touchscreen calibration tool, all within the standard Windows setup UI. So now let's take a tour of Windows XP. So to move around the mouse, we have a track point. I think mine's missing the cover on the right. We also have our 3 mouse buttons, our left click, right click, and then middle click. We have a zoom button, which basically just changes the resolution, although the screen in this device itself is only 800 by 600. A rotate button to flip the screen. It's kind of cool. It then gives some on-screen text to show you what the different buttons do. We have a dedicated brightness button. This control here also works like keyboard arrow keys. Next up, we have a hardware settings menu. The X closes the menu. The next option is a mute toggle, but if we use the cursor keys, it'll switch to a volume control. Next, we have direct access to the volume control. We have screen brightness again. Next is a toggle between internal and external display. And then finally a toggle to turn on or off Megabase. And the final button brings up an app for touch-based text input. We have an aquarium app. This is official Vaio software. A media player. Next text looks like the app that's called by the pen button. And note that this little stylus here that I'm using came with my Vaio UX. Pen Plus is a screen notation app. The Sony Notebook Setup app, which gives you access to a lot of the BIOS settings. Here you can see we can remap the hardware button. It can be different for the different orientations. Next, some touchscreen settings. This looks like a Wi-Fi hotspot finder app. Here's a video chat app. Next up is the user manual, and although it's pretty nicely organized and interactive, wish it would have just been a PDF. It looks to be using an embedded Internet Explorer browser. All the files are split up under tons of different folders, and this won't open in a modern browser. It looks like it's using some custom components. So you look at the built-in factory wallpaper and screensavers. I'm sure you can probably customize this, but the built-in screensavers all come with sound effects. And finally, the Windows properties for this file. But that's it. Thanks for watching.